Well, welcome everybody. It's a very interesting day to be having this particular event and to be welcoming our honored guest. As you well know, P5+1 and Iran negotiations resuming in Geneva. Who knows? We might see some kind of interim agreement emerge in the coming days. Of course, all of us are asking the question, what might such an agreement look like? Would it be a good agreement? How should we go about evaluating the quality of an agreement? What would be the next steps in practical terms? What are the prospects of arriving, negotiating a final agreement? How does this impact the broader relationship between Iran, the United States, and all of the countries in the region? And finally, where does this entire sequence of events potentially end up? Where do we want it to end up? Well, those are all very tough questions, and we're fortunate to have somebody who might not have all of the answers, but that can at least guide us through thinking through some of the answers to these questions. He's a very seasoned observer of Iran. Michael Singh is the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is a non-partisan think tank in Washington. Previously, he was the senior director for Near East and North African Affairs at the White House between 2007 and 2008, and director for several Middle Eastern countries, including Syria, on the NSC staff in the years prior to that. He also served as special assistant to Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. So I'm sure that like you, like me, that you're very interested in hearing his answers to those questions. Without further ado, maybe you'll join me in welcoming Michael Singh.
All right, so the answer to all those questions is I don't know, and I'll spend the next 45 minutes explaining why. It's a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate you all coming to listen to this, and I appreciate Roland and Isabel and the Center for hosting me here. What I want to do is you're going to hear a lot, especially if there is a deal concluded in the next day or two on Iran's nuclear program. You're going to be hearing a lot about this issue, and you're going to be hearing a lot of, if you pay attention to news stories, details about centrifuges and enriched uranium stockpiles and so forth. And what I hope that I can do in this discussion is give you some context for all that and give you a sort of way to think about it, which you won't get in the news stories that come out about it, but will help you, I think, understand those news stories. And for those of you who are students, hopefully a way to understand how policymakers think about these foreign policy problems, or at least the way I think they should think about these foreign policy problems. I think that if you're interested in solving a foreign policy problem, the essential task that you have is to match tools and resources to a strategy to your interests and objectives. That is really what making foreign policy is about. But it's not only about you as Canada or as the United States. In an issue like this, it's also about the other party. And you have to understand in the case of a conflict like this, in the case of a confrontation like this, how not only your own interests and objectives, but you have to be able to understand the interests and objectives of the other side, which doesn't mean that you agree with them. It doesn't mean that you adopt them somehow as your own. It doesn't even mean that you have to compromise with them. But it means that in order to effectively address the issue, you have to understand them. And so I want to start not by talking again about centrifuges and uranium, but by talking about Iran. And how do we understand this issue in the context of Iran's history and where Iran stands today? One of the big challenges we have in the West, and especially in the United States, less so here in Canada, is that we don't understand Iran very well. The United States hasn't had diplomatic relations with Iran for decades now. And so for U.S. diplomats, Iran is a bit of a black box. I would say that even for other Western diplomats who are posted in Iran, Iran is a bit of a black box because if you ask Canadian diplomats, if you ask European diplomats who are posted in Iran, very few of them have access to high levels, for example, of the regime. I want to start then by talking a little bit about Iran's background. So the first and most important thing I think to note about Iran is that this is a very old country. Now that may sound like a very obvious statement, but it's not so obvious when you think about the Middle East. The Middle East is largely composed of new countries whose boundaries have been drawn very recently. Iran is not such a country. Iran is a country that has been a country in basically its current form. It's grown, it's shrunk, it's grown for thousands of years, quite literally. And there's, I would say, no country in this particular region which has that same history, except for perhaps Egypt. And you see that Iranians have a very clear sense of national identity, even though Iran is actually a very diverse place, ethnically speaking, religiously speaking, historically speaking. There is a clear sense of the Iranian or the Persian identity. And this is a country which obviously sits at a geographical crossroads and has a lot of experience, both in the modern times and in ancient times, of dealing with foreign powers coming through. From the Mongols to the Russians and British to, in their view, the Americans to today. And a lot of unpleasant experiences with that, and therefore a lot of suspicions of the motives of foreign powers. And Iran also has a history of political ferment, which is very important to note. From its earliest days, Iran was ruled by secular or military rulers, kings, shahs, and so forth, supported by a clerical class, a clergy. That was originally Zoroastrian, then Islamic, obviously now Shia Islamic. But Iranians frequently challenged their rulers. There were a number of periods in Iranian history where rulers were overthrown, rulers were removed, and oftentimes it was because of the confluence of three trends. The first trend was the sense that the ruler was unjust or cruel. The second trend was the sense that Iran or Persia or whatever the name it was at the time had been somehow was humiliated on the world stage, was not taking its rightful place amongst nations. And the third trend would be a sort of sundering of the connection between the rulers and the clergy, a loss of support for the rulers by the clergy. These three trends often come together, and you have political ferment, you have regime change in Iran, to use a modern term. There were three revolutions, in fact, not just the one we all know best, but there were three revolutions in the 20th century. And I would say that in each one of these cases, the 1906 to 1911 constitutional revolution, the 1951 to 53 experience with Mohammad Mossadegh, who briefly didn't quite depose the Shah, but put him aside, and then the Islamic Revolution in 1979, you saw these three trends, I would say, come together in the 20th century in a very accelerated way. And what you saw was a coalition come together, sort of galvanized by these three trends, of liberals, secular people on the one hand, and clergy on the other, but not the top-ranking clergy, but sort of mid-level activist clergy coming together with very different worldviews, very different views about where Iran should go for the future, but similar kind of proximate objectives and interests. And once they had accomplished those proximate objectives, the coalition fell apart. And only in 1979 did the revolution actually succeed in sustainably and permanently overthrowing the regime. In 1906 through 1911, the Shah came back. 53, the Shah came back. But in 79, obviously the Shah didn't come back. And it is also true, although I wouldn't want to sort of draw a causal connection here, that that was the one experience where it was the clerical side which dominated the secular side. And it is important to know, those of you who have actually studied Iran, from 1951 to 53, we think of Mohammad Mossadegh, but there were clergy backing him, and that support from the clergy was quite important. And when he lost it, is when I think he began to really lose his grip on power. And the same thing is true of the constitutional revolution, but that starts to go back much further. So we have now this revolutionary regime, which originated in 1979, is still in power, obviously. And I would say it's a regime of paradoxes. And what do I mean by this? Well, Iran is on the one hand a democracy. You see elections, you see real voting take place. But it's on the other hand a dictatorship. The voting that takes place is not for any candidate who wishes to run, but the candidates who are very carefully vetted by unelected authorities. And you see that whoever wins the presidential elections is still subordinate to the supreme leader. And you see that, in fact, not just for the president's supreme leader, but in every case, for every secular institution in Iran, there is also a revolutionary or clerical institution that's superior. So there's a paradox. There's a paradox that's related to this of Iran's sort of pan-Islamic rhetoric. The supreme leader of Iran has pretensions to being a leader of the entire Islamic world, versus sort of very strong sectarianism in terms of Iran's foreign policy, but also in terms of Iran's domestic policy. There isn't freedom of religion even for Muslims in Iran, for example. You go try to find a Sunni mosque in Tehran, for example. So that's also a paradox in Iran. And then there's also this paradox, which is perhaps the most powerful and important paradox between Persian nationalism, Iranian nationalism, and the revolutionary ideology of 1979, which are often at odds with one another. And this type of paradox is one that many Iranian regimes, including this one, have had to grapple with. I would say that the main objective for this regime is to preserve itself, which is not a radical idea, that a regime would want to preserve itself. But that tends to be the overriding objective, and a very important objective, because, as I said, this regime sprang up in 1979 from a particular era in both Iranian history and world history. And I think if you looked at polls from inside Iran, to the extent you can trust them, you'd find that the popularity and sort of legitimacy, not just of the regime, but the ideology underpinning the regime, has really faded since 1979. The young generation of Iran, which is now sort of the majority of the Iranian population, was not alive in 1979 and doesn't identify necessarily with the revolution of 1979. And so the regime obviously has an uphill battle in terms of preserving the 1979 system and ideology. The main threats that I would say the regime faces from its perspective, number one is this disaffection, an internal political challenge from various groups of people who want to change the system. Not necessarily overthrow the regime, but change the system inside Iran. Number two, economics, an economic challenge, which is in part due to sanctions, which we hear a lot about now, but in part due to other things, in part due to the particular type of economic system that Iran has adopted, which is one which is relatively isolated from the world economy, not just because of sanctions, but also because of policy choices by Iran. And third, external military threats. Obviously, Iran lives in a neighborhood, not just the Middle East, but also on the other side, where there are a lot of external military threats, and I think Iran would judge the United States as one of those external military threats, for example. This combination of challenges, this combination of threats and Iran's ideology has led to a particular set of choices, a particular strategy, and a strategy is a set of choices by the regime, which puts it into sort of perpetual conflict with the West, perpetual conflict with our interests. It has eschewed, this Iranian regime has eschewed the path that some other countries in the region who may not be particularly fond of the West have taken, of sort of cooperation with the West, cooperation internationally, integration internationally into sort of into international norms and bodies and so forth. It has rejected that approach. And instead, it's adopted a very different sort of strategy. In domestic politics, its strategy is to promote revolutionary ideology, while I would say sort of ruthlessly maintaining and even tightening its grip. And you see that this manifests itself in big contradictions between what the regime says and what it actually does. So the regime, for example, I think a good example of this is one I already mentioned. You have elections in Iran, but they're not real elections in the way that we would think of them because of the way that the candidate pool is vetted. So there's a appearance of freedom without real freedom underlying it. The regime, for example, talks about the defense of the poor or the dispossessed, as they'd be called in Iran. But in fact, what you see, I think, in reality in Iran is something that looks much more like a kleptocracy that rewards the elites that support the regime and so forth, which again is certainly not unique in the world. On the economic side, we have seen that, as I said, Iran has isolated itself. It hasn't just been isolated by sanctions, but there's this idea of an economy of resistance, of economic self-sufficiency, which Iran has adopted, and sort of a self-isolation economically. And yet, again, as a paradox, highly, highly dependent on revenue from oil exports, on trade with the world, the trade of just this one commodity, essentially. And efforts to sort of diversify that, efforts to expand Iran's economic vision have largely been defeated. This was something, for example, that former president, Rafsanjani, had proposed, sort of going the route of China, economic reform without political reform. That isn't the route that Iran chose to take. And on the security side, Iran has chosen a security strategy which has emphasized asymmetry. And this security strategy in particular has put Iran in conflict with its neighbors, with us, and so forth. And what do I mean when I say asymmetry? Rather than trying to match the conventional capabilities of neighbors, of us certainly, Iran has invested in proxies. Iran has invested in, we would say, terrorism. Iran has invested in things like miniature submarines and frogmen and mines and so forth, things which are meant to be low cost but highly effective, asymmetry. The regime's challenges, however, I would say over time have increased rather than decreased. And what do we see? What are the examples of this? On the political side, I mentioned these contradictions between the revolutionary rhetoric and the reality in Iran. Well, I think that many political movements have sort of capitalized on pointing out these contradictions and trying to sort of shame the regime with these contradictions. This is true of the Green Movement, which I think wanted to point out that Iran, the regime was not the democracy that it claimed to be, that the vote, for example, in 2009 was not a fair vote, and that the regime did not live up to the morals and virtues that it claimed to, for example, because it tortured prisoners. But Ahmadinejad, the former president, also, I think, operated in this way, except he chose a different tack. He pointed out to the embarrassment of the regime that, in fact, it wasn't supporting the poor and the dispossessed. He took a kind of more populist approach to this, and he characterized himself as someone who wanted to return the regime to what he considered more of its true roots of the revolution. By, he would hand out potatoes, for example, to voters and do things which were quite sort of explicitly populist. But these were just, I would say, obviously I wouldn't compare the Green Movement and Ahmadinejad in terms of my view of their virtues, but in many ways they both were ways to try to point out and capitalize on these contradictions which you see in Iran. The economic challenges have certainly increased, and that's largely because of the sanctions on oil, EU sanctions, US sanctions, and so forth, which have caused Iran's oil revenues, on which its government budget depends vitally, to go down to a very dangerous level for Iran. And even the revenues which it's gaining often are held in escrow in places like China, Japan, South Korea, and so forth, which is an element of the current negotiations. And on the security side, I think we've seen that Iran's security strategy has simply not been terribly successful. That Iran has been successful in a modest degree in projecting power, but frankly has not been able to project power certainly the way that it had hoped to do when the revolution started in 1979. So why is all this relevant to what's happening now? I hope that those of you who are students of international relations wouldn't necessarily ask that question, but maybe you should, because it is important, I think, to think about how does history and kind of the nature of a government like this affect the current problems that we face and the current policy issues that we face. I do think it's important that we understand Iran's policy choices, Iran's behavior in the context of Iran, because too often we will try to see in another state a mirror of ourselves and assume that they'll make the same policy decisions that we would if faced with the same incentives and disincentives. It's not the case. It's not the case with Iran. It's not the case with any state. Some states are more similar, other states less so, but you have to understand the context from which they're operating. We worry, I would say, so much about Iran's nuclear program because of this larger picture. Not just because we oppose nuclear proliferation, but we do. Canada and the United States both have very strong policies on that. But because of this larger strategy that Iran has adopted, the nuclear program is just one element, perhaps the most dangerous and alarming element, of Iran's larger security strategy. And that's very important to keep in mind when you're thinking about this issue. This isn't an arms control negotiation with the Netherlands. This is something quite different from that. And Iran will sort of try to play on this by saying, well, you have double standards. To me, that's sort of a false notion, because it's not as though there is a standard for the way you deal with states. You deal with states sort of as they are. And the reason we're so concerned about what Iran is doing is because of the way Iran has conducted itself and defined its security strategy. This also, I think, this context can tell us why the nuclear talks, why this nuclear issue is so hard. It's hard, frankly, to find incentives that are compelling to Iran. If you look at how Iran defines its interests, well, the West is not going to offer Iran help in sort of consolidating its domestic power, for example. It's just not something we're prepared to do. If Iran isn't interested, for example, in joining the WTO, if it's not interested in having this kind of integration into world trade, well, then offering it membership isn't going to be much of an incentive. And so, again, understanding how Iran sees the world will help you understand whether your incentives and disincentives are actually motivating for the regime. And then, it's also hard because the nuclear program is, I think, actually quite key to the regime's security strategy. Remember I said that asymmetric strategy. Well, obviously nuclear weapons are, in a sense, an asymmetric capability. You might argue they're not asymmetric because they've been so costly for Iran, but generally we would consider it an asymmetric capability. And it also, I think, suggests that a sustainable solution to the nuclear question requires not just, as I said, an arms control agreement, not just a limitation on Iran's nuclear program, but it really requires something more like a strategic shift by Iran. It requires Iran to reconsider its security strategy, to reconsider its strategy more fundamentally, which is why I think you hear the kind of hopefulness that you do about Rouhani's election, because I think Western officials look at that and say, well, maybe this represents a kind of evolution or a step in a different direction by Iran. Maybe this means that sort of idea that was rejected of Rafsanjani's in the 90s, the idea that you could have economic reform and more integration with the West, is an idea that Iran is now ready to pursue, a strategic shift, as opposed to just a tactical compromise. What has been our strategy for dealing with this nuclear question? At one level, it's very simple, I would say. Making Iran believe that the costs of pursuing a nuclear weapon outweigh the benefits of pursuing a nuclear weapon, and by sort of keeping that military option, as we say, on the table, that in any event we won't allow them to ever get there. That when it comes down to it, if we had to, we would use military force to stop them. But also at the same time, keeping the door open to a compromise, keeping the door open to a negotiation, keeping open an exit rate, as it were, so that we're not locked in confrontation, but there's a possibility for a more positive outcome. So that is simple on its face. But at another level, maybe at a more fundamental level, there is a big disagreement, I would say, between officials who approach this issue. And the question is, would a sustainable solution to the nuclear problem be a cause or a consequence of a strategic shift? I think that the sort of paradigm that we're operating by now, in these current talks that you see today, are that, in fact, a strategic shift will follow a nuclear compromise. That we need to somehow cool down this issue, maybe establish some more trust and confidence and a better working relationship, and then Iran can be persuaded to change its strategy. I think our allies who you hear from who are so worried about this, Israel, the Gulf states, maybe some European states, others believe the opposite, that no, in fact, until Iran decides that it needs to take a different route, any nuclear agreement is by definition going to be temporary, because that incentive for them, that impetus for them to pursue a nuclear program will remain in place. So that is obviously a pretty big difference, pretty fundamental difference. As I said, though, the current talks, I think, follow the former paradigm. And what do we see now? Now we see this phased approach, this idea that you'll have a first step agreement and then follow on with more sort of permanent status talks, as it were. And I think that what you see that's motivating that is a real sense of urgency on both sides. Sometimes the two sides pretend not to feel a sense of urgency, kind of play it cool or nonchalant, but there is a sense of urgency on both sides. I think on the Western side, on the P5+1 side, what you see is there's a view that Iran is getting dangerously close to having a very short breakout period. And maybe if I could just say very briefly what a breakout period is, but I mean by that the time that it would take Iran from where it stands today to having enough weapons-grade uranium for one nuclear weapon. We can get more into in the Q&A whether that's really the right metric. You might say, well, Iran would never produce one nuclear weapon. That would be silly. You'd want multiple nuclear weapons to be secure. Let's put that aside for right now. There is a sense of urgency, though, because of this, because the expansion of Iran's nuclear program has reduced its breakout time. For Iran, obviously, the economic sanctions have been quite punishing. And there is this sense that you get from reading the Iranian press, listening to Iranians, that they have a real desire to get that pressure relieved. That, I would say, is this urgency, the fact that we're now coming together is not just an effect of the sanctions. I think our officials like to say, well, the reason we can have these talks now is because of the sanctions. That is partly true. But it's also important to, if you trace the history of these talks, to note that we have softened our own positions. You'll now hear the idea of zero enrichment in Iran described as a maximalist position, whereas a few years ago, this was the unanimous opinion of the UN Security Council, including the Russians and Chinese and Qataris and people like this. So our own position has softened. And it's important to bear in mind that both of those things have been in operation. And those of you who are interested in that kind of dynamic, more particularly, I have an article in International Security, which I wrote, I guess it's now a year ago, where I kind of go through this in gory detail with charts and graphs and so forth, which I'd be happy to refer you to. And there's also this sense, beyond the kind of effect of sanctions and changing positions, that the election of Rouhani offers a window of opportunity. Whether or not this is true is another question. Does Rouhani represent a genuine chance? Do we have this short window of opportunity where if we don't take it, then the hardliners in Iran will somehow swallow him whole? It's of course not knowable. I think looking at the situation, looking at Iran's presidential campaign, what Rouhani's mandate appears to be from the supreme leader, which doesn't necessarily tell you what he himself wants, but what his mandate appears to be, is to get sanctions relief. And I would expect that means sanctions relief at the minimum possible cost to Iran, not because I have inside information, but because that's logical. But I think Western officials do hope that Rouhani represents something more. And so what you see in these talks is, yes, in part an effort to just get a nuclear deal and freeze this program and stop it from moving forward, but also maybe to grab onto something bigger than that, to test whether he represents something more. And that's, I think, what these talks represent. Now, as far as the structure of the talks go, those of you who have followed this issue may know that many people have been arguing that the United States should now pursue, the P5+1 should now pursue, and I'm sorry I always say the United States instead of the P5+1 and so forth, that's just how Americans are. Many argue for a comprehensive deal. Let's solve everything at once. Let's not have a phased agreement. Let's not relieve any sanctions until we get everything we need from Iran. In part because, and that may sound when I say it that way maximalist, but the idea behind that, which also, by the way, is the way that the Israeli-Palestinian talks are going, whether you think that's a good model or not is maybe a matter of your viewpoint on how those have gone. The idea behind that is we have all this leverage. Let's make sure we use it to get what we need and not squander it, essentially. That's the idea behind people who want a comprehensive deal. That's not the approach we're taking, though. The approach we're taking is a phased approach, where you freeze the program, the nuclear program in place, with maybe some rollback of the program as well, and a rollback of sanctions as well, modest rollback. And you open up a 6-month window for those final status talks. The advantage, presumably, of this model is that it gives you some breathing room. Takes away some of that sense of urgency, that sense of crisis, and allows you to talk at maybe a slightly more leisurely pace. The disadvantage is the North Korea problem, I would call it. That, in fact, that interim agreement turns into a final agreement, that it keeps getting rolled over, and eventually this issue just kind of slips through your grasp. Eventually you get sidetracked, you're paying attention to other issues in the world, crises happen, you lose your handle on this, the sanctions may disintegrate, the other pressure may disintegrate, and Iran is able to kind of slide its way to a nuclear capability. But this is the approach we're taking, so the discussion of pros and cons is academic in a sense. Of course, we're in a university, so as Roland pointed out to me, that's not a bad thing that we have this discussion. The current deal, to succeed on its own terms, the current deal that's being discussed, and maybe you'll hear a deal being signed today or tomorrow, has to, number one, increase Iran's breakout time. Absolutely, that's the purpose of it. Right now, you might say the breakout time, again, meaning when Iran would be able to have, if it wanted to, one SQ or significant quantity, one weapons worth of weapons-grade uranium, is probably about, depending on who you ask, it's anywhere between 2 and 6 weeks. They want, obviously, to increase that to something much more comfortable. 6 months, perhaps, would be nice. Number two, the agreement has to make it easier for us to detect covert nuclear activities through transparency activities and monitoring and so forth. Those are the two things it has to achieve to be successful on its own merits. To that end, what does it need to do? And here I'm going to very briefly get into some of the technical stuff, but I'm not going to belabor it, but we can talk more about it in the Q&A for those who are interested. You have to address Iran's 20% enrichment program. You have to end 20% enrichment and eliminate the 20% enriched uranium stockpile. You have to stop Iran's advanced centrifuge program. No more production of them and no installation of them. You have to reduce the number of centrifuges that Iran is using to enrich to a low level, 3.5% or 5%. And ideally, you'd also want to eliminate at least some of that 3.5% low enriched uranium stockpile. Now, why would you want to do all of this? Because these are the variables which determine Iran's breakout time. I'm going to leave it at that for now. And some of you who are more into the technical details may have some questions about that. But beyond that, that's just the uranium path. Obviously, Iran has two paths to a nuclear weapon. There's uranium and there's plutonium. The plutonium side, that involves this Arak heavy water reactor, which you've probably heard about. And there, what the P5+1 is going to look for is hopefully that construction be stopped. The reason that that's so important is, as far as I understand it, that once the fuel is loaded into a heavy water reactor of that sort, it really becomes unbombable in a sense, without taking a massive risk because of the radioactive fallout that would ensue from attacking that kind of facility. So that's a real flashpoint. It's a potential red line for military action. So stopping the construction is important to gain this kind of breathing space. You might ask, well, what about, a nuclear weapon has three components. It has the fuel, I've already talked about the fuel. It has the weaponization, which means knowing how to take the fuel and turn it into something that can produce a nuclear explosion. That's theoretical work, which we have to assume has largely been done by Iran. And the third component is a delivery vehicle. So you might say, well, the other part of this needs to be stopped is the missile program and the space launch program, the efforts to build an intercontinental ballistic missile. Unclear whether that's going to even be addressed in negotiations. In addition to all of that, you want to see, because again, of the need to be able to detect covert work, you want to see more transparency measures. Better access for inspectors, broader access for inspectors, quicker access for inspectors, and so forth. Those of you who paid attention to the Iraq inspections in the 1990s know what this sort of thing looks like. That's the gold standard, the Iraq inspections. I doubt that that's anything close to what we'd be able to get with Iran. Of course, it's a diplomatic deal, so Iran has to get something too. And that's the other side of this. How much relief do you give Iran? You want to give Iran enough relief that they agree to the deal, but not so much relief that they don't have any further incentive to negotiate. And obviously, there's sharply differing opinions as to where that line appropriately falls. But obviously, an interim agreement, a first step agreement, is by definition a first step. And so what follows that? This is really the key question now, because I think a lot of us assume that some deal will come out of this process in Geneva. So what's the next step? The next step immediately is implementation. And the parties will need to, as soon as they have this agreement done, get together and say, okay, how are we going to implement this? Protocols for implementation. This is absolutely critical and may even be harder than getting the agreement, because in the past, what we've seen Iran do, when they reached agreements with the EU in 2003 and 2004, is essentially immediately, from our perspective, cheat on the agreement. From Iran's perspective, kind of creatively do stuff that they felt was allowed by the agreement. So we'll want to make sure there aren't loopholes that allow Iran to do things which we assumed would have been forbidden by the agreement. So that will be the next phase, getting these implementation protocols negotiated. I don't know, frankly, if they're doing that in parallel with negotiating the agreement or if that will be subsequent. I imagine it's subsequent because it's a big piece of work. Then there's a question of, well, what would happen at the end of this 6-month period, if it is a 6-month period, if there's no agreement? What's the or else? What's the kind of, what we call it in negotiations theory, the no-deal option for Iran and the United States? There is that military option, which is supposedly on the table, but I think a lot of people think that, well, that's not really on the table. Whether or not that's true or not is only something that President Obama presumably knows. But given the Syria episode, given sort of what appears to be sort of fatigue of the U.S. administration and the U.S. population more broadly with war, I think a lot of the other people involved in this have assumed that that's not something that's likely going to happen. And that means that the only real or else is more sanctions. And this has been a big issue, obviously, in the United States. Should we be imposing sanctions now and say, well, those sanctions will take effect in 6 months if this agreement doesn't take hold? President Obama doesn't want Congress to do that, he said. He wants them just to hold off entirely and only impose the sanctions if the talks, in fact, fail. But then the question is, will we really be ready to say these talks have failed? And I think that folks in Congress, for example, are skeptical that the administration will be ready to do that. So there's this kind of back and forth that you see between the administration and Congress over this issue. We also need to try hard to maintain our coalition. One thing that has not been done well through the course of these talks, negotiations are not just negotiations with the party across the table. You also have to negotiate with the parties on your side of the table. And that appears to have been not done very well in this case. Maybe that's an understatement. You want to go into a negotiation with a strong hand, with your own side unified. And we haven't seen that. Instead, I think what we saw was an effort to present an agreement to allies as a fait accompli, and it didn't work. And in fact, I would say that had there not been this tension between allies, had there been a better effort beforehand, the last round, to get everybody on the same page, we might look at the last round and say, oh, it was kind of progress, but not quite there. Instead, people look at that as, wow, that was a big mess, right? And that's not what you want to say. So maintaining our coalition even after an interim agreement will be difficult. We'll have to show that we are open to a deal at the end of this. But that we'll have to still convince our allies that we're ready to somehow punish Iran, either striking or more sanctions at the end of the process. And at the same time, show that we're still committed to the region, that if we reach an agreement with Iran, it's not a sort of cut and run situation for the United States. We won't say, okay, well, that takes care of that problem. We're going to pivot to Asia now, see you later. That's not what our allies want to hear, but it's what they're worried about. That in fact, what this represents is the United States trying to disengage from this region by dealing with this problem and moving on. And that also raises the question of, will we use this interim period to discuss other issues? Because of course, as I mentioned, our only problem with Iran is not the nuclear issue. Iran's also active in Syria, it supports terrorism, has human rights violations inside Iran, something that Canada has really been a leader on. Are we going to raise those issues? I would say it makes sense to raise those issues. If you want to test if Rouhani is serious about changing Iran's approach to the West, the world, and so forth, well, see what he can do on some of these other issues in this period. I don't know if we'll do that or not. The biggest question is, what is the final objective of these talks from the perspective of the P5+1, from the perspective of the U.S., of Canada, and so forth? Is it eliminating Iran's nuclear program? Is it building trust and then letting Iran have its nuclear program and under inspections? Is it something in between those two? We haven't ever set that out. And one question I would have, and I hope the answer to this is yes, is do we know? Do our negotiators, do our governments know what they want the final outcome here to be? It had been the case that we wanted Iran to totally dismantle its nuclear program, zero enrichment. Now you hear that that's a maximalist position. I don't personally agree with that. I think it's not. In fact, we've seen lots of governments in the past, which had been nuclear, in fact, had nuclear weapons, give up their entire nuclear programs in exchange for better relations with the world. The other option, perhaps, would be to say, let Iran come clean. Let Iran open up its books, give access to inspectors, to its networks, to its scientists, the whole kit and caboodle. But Iran has resisted that sort of thing. The middle ground of sort of Iran continuing not to come clean, continuing to deceive about what it's actually done, not addressing the questions about its past, but being allowed to keep these nuclear capabilities, I think is the one that makes me most troubled and the one that makes our allies most troubled. And we'll have a hard time, again, achieving that kind of meeting of the mind within our own coalition to sustain that sort of deal. So let me just conclude by saying, after so many years of talks, I think that the temptation with this issue, for negotiators and probably for all of us here who have been listening to all this for so long, I'm not talking about my talk, I'm talking about the past 10 years. The temptation is just to take the best deal we can get and move on. Be done with this issue, essentially. But the important thing to remember, again, especially for those of you who are students of foreign policy, is that that is an illusion. There's no moving on. Because if we don't handle it right, we'll be coming back to this issue in the future and we'll be in a worse position. So we can't succumb to this temptation of let's just be done with this and move on. We have to reach a solution which is going to be sustainable. We cannot force that kind of strategic shift which I talked about on Iran. But if my opinion, my view, what we can require Iran to do is to really face the consequences of its choices. So rather than helping Iran maintain its paradoxes, to require Iran to reconcile its paradoxes, if it's going to have the kind of relationship with the West that President Rouhani says that he wants. I'm going to leave it at that and look forward to taking your questions.